Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Parenting is Easy podcast, where we will discuss the pleasures and the frustrations, the good and the bad, and the rewarding and the troubling aspects of parenting. I am your host, Hananya Abraham, and I'm a psychotherapist that specializes in working with teenagers, young adults, and parents with a specific niche in assisting with communication within the family dynamics. While everyone has their own unique journey and experiences as a parent and as a child, there are many common affiliations and attributes that we can all relate to and share. Together, we will learn from personal stories and experiences from parents across many different backgrounds, cultures, and communities. So get comfortable, grab your glass of coffee, and let's get right into the interview. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode, part 2 of a series that we are doing with Meredith. So I would highly recommend that you go back and listen to part 1 because this is a continuing conversation that we are having. I am your host, Hananya Abraham, here on the podcast. Parenting is easy, said no one ever. And if anyone has listened to part 1, you can see how hard sometimes parenting can be. So Meredith, getting right back into it and continuing on this amazing story that I think can be very relatable to a lot of people, but I think also can be very informative to a lot of people. And going into specifically the concept of preparing for loss within the family and having that conversation with your daughter. Can you talk a little bit about what parents can do and what your experience is like having that conversation?
First of all, from my professional life, when you're discussing something bad that has happened with a child, you want to make sure you address them in their age group. You don't want to tell a 2-year-old, well, Grammy's gone to heaven. Cool, what's that mean? They don't know what that means. And you want to use concrete language and you want to say things that they can understand. You don't need to go into overly gory detail. But what I told my daughter when we lost that 15-week pregnancy was that I sat her down. I said, I know mommy was at the hospital. I know you had a long night at your friend's house. The reason why is because, remember, we talked about the baby brother that was coming. Mama went to the doctor and his heart had stopped working and he wasn't growing anymore. And so he died. And I was at the hospital because they had to take him out of mommy's tummy. And that was the most concrete, straightforward way I could think of to tell her what had happened.
And that's not easy.
No, it's not easy. And I was crying. Obviously, she was 3.5, and her immediate reaction was to throw something at me. Like, she took her crayons and she threw them at me. And I was like, are you mad at mommy? And she said, yes. Well, you can be mad at mommy. It's allowed. I get it. But mommy is very sad too. And so is daddy. And we're still a family and we're going to work through this. And she went off, and that was really all that happened in the minute, was that she reacted very angry, and then she did not want to be in my presence anymore, which is very natural. That's a very standard grief reaction for a 3.5-year-old. Their reaction is anger. And one of the things that you're trying to do when you're giving them that straightforward language is to not let them think that it's something that they did. If you give them a concrete answer, then they can process past that magical thinking that is obviously something that they did is wrong. If you give them language that they can't process, a lot of times they make up their own narrative to fit what they heard. And then they can think that I did something bad and this is why this happened, because they're very selfish little creatures. That's just how it is, right? They're the center of their own world. And so then what we look for later is reactions that are grief reactions that may not look like what you or I would react to with grief. Last time we talked about the cheese, right? Can I bring my cheese to Michigan? This time, my mom was there with us and she was trying to make sure that Reagan was taken care of so that my husband and I could just kind of process and my body could recover, right? He's been through surgery and you don't just feel better after a DNC. I remember Reagan is my daughter's name. Reagan had tried to take some popcorn from my mom was eating popcorn and she tried to take some from grandma. And grandma said, Reagan, that's not nice. Can you ask grandma? And instead of asking like she normally would, she threw the popcorn on the floor and she started crying. And I heard where I was in the other room and I heard my mom say, that's not how we talk to grandma. Can you ask grandma nicely? And Reagan ran away and she started to get more popcorn for herself from the drawer and was like having a total meltdown. And my mom was trying to work through like, that makes grandma sad. And like, that's not how I parent. So that was also an issue, but like, dropped everything, like ran into that room and picked her up and was like, it's okay to be sad. Mommy's sad too. Like, we know that this is not about the popcorn, not about the cheese. It's not about the popcorn. It's about you're sad and you're 3.5 and you don't know how to say it. And so we give you time to cry and we don't punish you for having a tantrum because
It's not really a tantrum.
it's not really a tantrum yet. Just having a grief reaction. And sometimes that's hard to identify, right? But you can tell. You're the parent usually. And sometimes I can't tell, but usually you can tell. And then as you move through it, you say that you're sad because you're not going to have a baby brother anymore. And she said, yeah. And then the other thing to expect as a parent of a kid who's grieving is that they don't process things all at once right now. Nobody does. If you've lost somebody as a child, you process that grief through every stage, every new stage of development. So when I was 14, I lost my father. I processed it again at graduation. I processed it again when I got married. There's things that this is a new stage of my life. And I have a new understanding as an adult of how to process this. And so when you have a baby, you have a child that's processing a loss at 3.5, then it's going to come up again because then you see other friends whose mommies have babies in their tummies. And that makes us sad sometimes. Or we talk about a book where somebody has a baby brother and that makes us sad and we have to talk about it again. And then the other thing to be prepared for is that kids don't realize that socially it's not really acceptable to tell people on the playground that mommy lost a baby. Like, mommy had a baby in her tummy and then she went to the hospital and his heart wasn't working and he died. That's a conversation we've had on the playground a lot.
Oh, gosh.
Thank you.
Yeah. When she turns 20, between throwing crayons at you and telling the whole world about this, you're going to have a plethora of stories to be laughing about. But obviously, in the moment, it could be really difficult. But you bring up a very good point regarding how a child processes. And one of the mentors in the parenting world that I have is Dan Siegel. He has so many different books and different things for parenting from the inside out and the 12 different ways of helping a child process different things. And one of the things that he's talked about, I actually think I have, one of his books. It's called The Whole Brain Child. Highly recommend it. I actually did literally right here. One of his topics that he talks about is realizing that the two sides of a child's brain there's like a wall in between them. And for the logic that they're getting and from that imaginative side, it's to be able to put those two things together. It's almost like putting oil and water together. And for a child to be able to process things in a way that it's able to settle within them could be difficult. And you're talking about being able to acknowledge and have awareness to that specific point of, this is not really a tantrum. She's not being flippant with your mom. She's not on purpose throwing this popcorn. She's going through something. And being able to talk with the child and say, hey, what you're feeling is normal and that's okay. And letting the child talk it out for what they need. That's how you slowly get the oil and the water to mix together. And it's through that rewiring of being able to talk it out and just say what's on your mind. You're sad. I understand that, but tell me why you're sad. Talk it out. You want to throw something? Go ahead. Tell me why you're throwing something. And I think it's by being able to express and talk about it. And there's another concept that's talked about a lot in parenting, more on the recent side of this, something that I read about, a concept called teach back, where when you tell a child something, you have them say, do you understand what I'm saying? Can you teach it back to me?
That's a well-used thing in nursing. Nursing, you have not taught anybody anything unless you can teach it back.
Okay, I did not know that. Thank you for letting me know. But I think when it comes to children going through something traumatic, finding out that I'm not going to have the part of my family, another core pillar to this family, and we're not going to be able to continue doing things as that group of four, that's hard. That is really, really, really hard. And for a child to be able to express it in their way, however they feel they need to, is, I think, very, very important, which is, I think, the biggest takeaway from this. So as you continue on this journey, and grieving for something like this is not something that takes 24 hours. So I'm curious where you sort of go from there and how has that led you to the next stages?
So for us, we both acknowledged this is a thing that takes a lot of time. And we said it to like most family members who were asking us, like, how are you doing? What do you feel? And we're like, what we feel is that we need time. And what my lab values and what the fertility doctors and everybody is telling us is that we don't have a lot of time. So we can't say, it's okay, we'll take a break, we'll address this in a year, or we'll address this in 6 months. There was a multitude of reasons why we were kind of on the clock. There's hormone levels that indicate how good your egg reserve is. Mine is not great. I'm on the early side of things as far as a late 30s woman. But then also we were living in a place that had a very good infertility benefit. We had $20,000 that we could put towards IVF, which is it's one of the best IVF benefits in healthcare in the nation. And we were like, we should use this.
Yeah, for those of you not aware, having that amount of money from situation is probably at least the most that I've heard of.
It's incredibly rare. Like the institution we were at before, they had $10,000, which was, again, we felt so lucky. We're like, oh my gosh, it's crazy. It was like my job, we had no benefits for that sort of thing. And then at this second institution, we could have $20,000. It still wasn't going to cover the whole thing, but it's way better than paying all of that out of pocket. So basically what we did is we said, well, we're going to process this as we process it. We're going to call that infertility doctor and get on the schedule right now. And because we had already been working with them, there was no like wait time. They were very good at working with us, and they knew that we were leaving the Michigan area in July. They really worked really hard with us to get IVF done before we left. Processing that through IVF is hard because you're still getting your body jammed full of hormones and you're taking a bunch of injections and you gain 20 pounds if you're me. Again, it was all that stuff we talked about in the last episode about not feeling at home in your body and alienation. And now that I've had diagnosable fetal intolerance, there's a lot of things that maybe you could do in your last pregnancy, but you can't do now. Kids, coffee, goodbye. Do you exercise? Not anymore. You walk. How's that for your sex life? Not great. You're not supposed to do that either. There's a lot of changes when you go into that. We were successfully pregnant. They put me on blood thinners as a precaution because the only thing they found with the last loss was blood clots. It's again a kind of experimental situation because they don't have a diagnosed clotting disorder, but I also couldn't find anything else wrong. So I'm on blood thinners for all of this pregnancy, but I am currently 21 weeks today pregnant with another baby boy. So we're cautiously optimistic. We've had good checks and all of that. And as far as dealing with the loss during this pregnancy, I have a very supportive team here in Chicago. They are very aware of my history. A lot of that takes advocating for yourself. Like, I am anxious. This is why. Don't tell me it's nothing. Because to me, it's something. And sorry, that means extra visits for you. My team here is very, very accommodating and very understanding. When you have lost that many pregnancies, there's a lot of anxiety that comes with it. And the only way to get through it is to go through it.
I think that goes a very long way of being able to understand that it's about going through it and just picking yourself up and going through it. At the same time, that can be very, very difficult. And that can be something that it could be hard if you don't have the right supportive cast around you. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what people can do to find that supportive cast. Like, where can they look in order to find what could be beneficial going through both a pregnancy after loss, but also after a loss?
First of all, if you're working with any fertility clinic, all of them have a dedicated social worker that is a therapist in almost all cases. And if they don't, they know somebody who is. They can put you in contact with a support group. They can give you resources as far as other women's experience, other people to talk to, what to expect. They can put you in contact with a mental health professional if you need something prescribed or whatever it is. Usually the social worker at a fertility clinic is very, very on top of that. Same thing if you're at a good ER, hopefully. If you had the situation like we talked about in the last episode where you have like an unplanned or a no warning sign loss, ER should give you resources about what is happening and what it's going through. And if they don't, it's easy to say, but you can say, hey, this is going to be hard for me. What do I do? And if they can't tell you, ask harder. Obviously, I'm fortunate to have been taken care of in some of the biggest names of medicine because of my husband's job. But we still have had many instances in which I am the patient. And yes, you are the doctor, and that is great, but this is what I'm feeling. And if you tell me it's nothing, I'm going to need you to think different. And finding out a way to say that louder but nicer, like louder but nice. I think also Google is a great, great tool for all of these things, working through loss. I have a list of, they're not pregnancy loss specific, but they are children, like for children who've lost somebody, specific resources that I can send you if you want links at the end of the show notes.
And that's something that we could for sure add to the show notes. And I want to go back to what you're talking about, Google being a good source. I am skeptical on that, even though I'm not disagreeing with you, because I think there is a place for it being beneficial, but not being something that is relied upon. So what's that balance when it comes to finding something that is so vital? And I think this support, especially after going through something like this, is so important. The guidelines.
Yeah. When I say Google, I don't mean any talk forum on the internet. Should have been more clear. I mean smart Googling, where you say support in pregnancy loss, resources for pregnancy loss, resources for child grief, or resources for grief after XYZ.
Near me.
Yeah, near me. You don't want to end up in chat rooms. Those places are awful and terrible. I'm sure some people have found great support groups in them, but I have not. And I don't think that's the universal experience. When you smart Google for resources, you want hard copy printed stuff that's published by organizations that have studied you and your situation. Or if there's a pregnancy loss support group, they should on their website have a list of resources. So it's really good to find the resources that the resources used as a very good resource, like a research tip anyway. If you're researching anything for grief and for support, that is how I use Google.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that clarification. I think that it's important for people to understand that it's a great tool and the internet is awesome. And we're here right now because of the internet.
Yes.
And there's another part of it that, especially when we need our support the most, to know how to use it in a way that will be long-term beneficial. I want to turn over here to something you were talking about before. And if you could talk about this a little bit, when a couple is going through infertility, it obviously adds a lot of pressure and age comes into play. But specifically regarding the intimacy that a couple faces together and sometimes not being able to do certain things together because of treatments that you're going through. Can you talk a little bit about or give some guidance to a couple going through this and how they can navigate through this very difficult time in their personal connection to each other?
I'm going to say this, even though it's really difficult for me. Again, I was raised very conservatively Christian, and you don't really talk about sex in that culture. You don't do it. It's not a thing that you talk about. So talking about intimacy at all for me is something that takes a lot of work, something it takes being very purposeful and trying to get rid of all of that is like naughty.
Taking away the taboo from a very, very beautiful thing within a relationship.
Right. And with all that being said, communication is the best, right? The only thing that you have when you're, again, it is difficult to go a very long time without being intimate with your partner. It does take a toll on your relationship, and working through that is however you connect. And I know it's really difficult to do, but if you get guidelines from your providers, it's like, don't have sex. I know it's embarrassing, but we should be sex positive providers just in general, from hospice to family care to anything. We should be sex positive. And the question, what can we do, is a totally fine one to ask your provider, and they should be able to converse with you on that. There's a whole lot about like whether or not the uterine contractions from orgasm is going to affect IVF, and then whether or not blah, blah, blah. They can work through you. It was like, is orgasm bad or is penetrative sex bad? And it depends on your situation. And a lot of places will be like, we don't care, have sex. That's fine. That wasn't our situation. Where it's like, just don't have sex for a couple weeks. Our situation, because I'm on blood thinners and like the anxiety that it would produce if we did bleed and all that sort of stuff, we have worked through. Just we talk about it and try to make time for our relationship outside of that. And when we feel comfortable, then we do. But we usually have to talk about it beforehand. Are you okay with the fact that this may happen? And like, what are we going to do if it does? And it takes a lot of romance out of intimacy.
Right. And that's a little bit of pressure in a certain way.
Yeah. I think sex is so important in a relationship, and connecting with your partner is so important. Providing that in a supportive environment, as long as you realize that, no, it's not always going to be spontaneous. That doesn't mean it can't be romantic and fun. You just talk about it. Which again, even here, you can see I'm like getting flustered. It's hard for me to talk about sex. I don't like doing it, but it's necessary.
Anytime you feel uncomfortable, there's something we can always, but I think it's so important, and considering your experience.
No, and I'm not saying I don't want to talk about it. I'm just saying that like it's very difficult for me to do.
Well, I think it's a very, very big part of infertility, because as a couple's going through infertility, there is a connection that could be broken or start having cracks in certain places. And being the importance of intimacy and sex within a couple, navigating how to go about it in a way that is beneficial for the couple is so important. That you talk about communication. Are there different guidelines or different, I guess, points of view when it comes to dealing with intimacy when a couple is also going through actual trying to get pregnant, but yet also going through treatment? Because you're talking about when you are pregnant and that being something, but then there's another category of, I don't know, should we be doing this or not doing this in the first place? And that there's a pressure when it comes to, hey, we only have a day or two or maybe a week in order for this to happen. And that can also take away from a connection of what intimacy can bring. So what guidelines would you give for something like that?
Okay, so first of all, I want to say this is not my area. I'm not in maternal fetal medicine. I'm not a midwife. Done a lot of research because I'm trying to like deconstruct my own upbringing on stuff, but I'm a hospice nurse practitioner. This is not my area. But what I have found is that making sure that you're having sex when it's not just the fertile window is really helpful. And even if you have to schedule it sometimes, knowing that this is our time to connect and be without that pressure is also really important. So you don't want sex to be reduced to just procreative experience, because once that's reduced to that, sometimes it can be very hard to get it back, and it requires work. It's not just my work. It has to be our work as a couple to like get back onto that track. I would say that I think that's a thing that a lot of women struggle with after they have a kid at all, not just in fertility and with trying for a kid. I think that once you've had your body undergo all these changes, it's really difficult to like think of this as a romantic relationship and not a co-working experience where we're trying to manage these little brats that live in our house. And for me personally, what I have found to be really helpful is, I don't know if you've heard about this app, it's called Rosie. The most effective treatment, and this is research proven, I know this, looked into it, the most effective treatment for women who are having low libido is like erotica. And that's another thing that I was like, wow, I am so uncomfortable with this topic. I don't like, as far
considering
as
your upbringing as well. Yeah, it can be very understandable.
Bad. Yeah. But I mean, we don't have pills for women's libido, but if we did, they haven't done any better than erotica reading for women. And so the Rosie app has a lot of sexual health coaching and wellness, and they don't pay me at all. They don't know who I am, but I have found this very helpful as far as like maintaining a spontaneous sexual environment. And
so this is Rosie, ROSY?
Yes, that's an app.
Okay. Well, just see if we can post a link to that as well for people that are more curious to learn about this. So we've covered the full gamut of things to where you are today. And I do want to talk, and I feel like I'm getting to more understanding more the concept of the storytelling and how you would like to give over things. But we're going to close on maybe one or two questions on that. I'm curious along this journey and everything that we've talked about today, are there maybe one or two things that we haven't talked about in this that you might want to bring to the table or that we left out?
I think if we go back to my experience as a hospice nurse practitioner, right, we've talked a lot about parenting a toddler through the loss of a potential sibling. We've talked a lot about parenting and pregnancy loss and working as a partnership through that. I think that adjacent to that is the parenting of a child through the loss of a family member, a parent, or somebody like that, and then working on that based off of their age group. It is a little bit off topic of what we have been discussing, but I feel like it goes with my experience.
And also your own personal experience.
Yes, and my own personal experience. I think that when we talk about preparing your kid, telling your kid in succinct language, and we were talking about with my daughter, if you're addressing a 6 or 7-year-old or a teenager, they are able to ask you questions, and they're going to have hard questions because they're smart. And a lot of times, if you haven't, and this is not to shame anybody because I haven't necessarily worked through all of my beliefs about death and dying and the afterlife and all those things, if you haven't processed how you feel about those things, if you're still avoidant of the loss or the anticipatory loss of a person, it can be very difficult to walk a child through that. Reaching out to your resources as an adult is very important. If you have the privilege of working with a hospice agency, reaching out to them, saying, I hear you have a bereavement coordinator. Do you have anything for me? What can I do now to help me better prepare to walk my kids through this? And answer their questions honestly. You don't want to tell them something is a yes or no when it's not. You don't want to tell them that everything's going to be fine if it's not. You want to make sure you're fostering a trust there, which is a whole lot easier said than done, is you also don't want to like trauma dump on your kid, but preparing them to deal with loss and telling them how we're going to get through this and things are going to be different, but we still love you and we're going to do this as a family. Or if you're losing a family unit member, how we're going to remember them, how we're going to talk about them, what things might be like in the future. And something that my parents did very well for me at 14. It's something that when you're working with children who are losing an adult in their lives, they have a lot of questions. Like I just keep saying, you need to give them room to ask those questions and give them room to know that sometimes we don't know the answers.
Yes. And that itself could be an answer. And that's okay. I think sometimes as parents, we want to be able to give an answer so badly that we'll start saying things that probably shouldn't be said. And I think the answer of, I don't know, there is no answer to that. It could be, depending on the situation, a very, very good answer. And you were talking about before, your daughter asking a lot of questions. I like telling people my 3 favorite letters in the alphabet are WHY. because I think there's no such thing as a bad question except the one not asked. And I think our job as parents, and especially when there's going to be something that you're going to be going through or you are going through, creating an environment, well, I like saying it the way it was told to me, is instead of the home being somewhere where it's, oh my gosh, I don't want to tell my parents that, or I can't tell my parents that. It should be, I can't wait to tell my parents that. We want to make it that because that's the environment you want to create where it's completely inviting. Does that mean they're going to come over to you? Probably not. But also just letting them know that there are situations that the door is always open for you to just come in, ask that question. And for a teenager to ask questions, if you get them to say good morning to you, it's a win for the day. So, and them asking questions about grief, about loss. And I think that goes a very long way. Our listeners here of the podcast, we have talked about this topic of grief, and we could probably have a whole episode just with Meredith, both from personally and professionally talking about grief, but it wasn't the full focus of what we've been talking about today. But I thank you for bringing that point up. We've also talked about this in episode, I think it's episode 6, conversation between a mom and a son that have also gone through loss as well. So I refer back to that to talk a little bit more about grief and how to get to that as a family dynamics. But if you could give 1 or 2 points, Meredith, regarding how parents can make sure that door stays open for their child from the parent's point of view, what would you say?
I think there's 2 main ones, right? One is making sure that you're telling, again, we don't want to trauma dump on our children, but acknowledging that, like, I'm going through this too. This is difficult for me too. This is how I am doing. And this is how I am feeling about this thing that is happening. And this is how I'm working through it. I don't feel good in my body right now. My body's really sad and my brain is really sad. And the way that mama makes myself feel better is usually I go for a run. And so I'm going to do that right now to take care of myself. What is the thing that makes you feel better? Why don't we try XYZ? I think the other thing, especially when we get into older children, is identifying other people that it is safe for your children to talk to. Again, if you have the privilege of working with a hospice person, it's okay to ask this person that's coming into your home. It's okay to ask them questions. It's okay to say, I'm scared. I don't know. I want information. What do I do? And you can identify those people for your child. Because if you don't have 10 years of hospice experience, you probably don't know all of the answers, right? Identifying those people that it's safe for your child to ask is really helpful.
That's great. I really appreciate that. And I think that's going to go a very long way when people can know what's available to them or where to find what is available to them, not just by Googling it.
But again, I'll send you those links because they're good links.
We will also post a link to that app that you were talking about for Rosie. So, the
Rosie app.
Okay. So I want to get a little bit into over here as we're closing up shop for today, storytelling and how that comes into play, both for your experiences that you've been through and how that's turned into what it is that you're doing now, but also in general, the concept of storytelling and how that's something that can be really helpful to parents.
Oh, yeah, I think we talked before about how I have used stories as a way to process my own grief and emotions. And I've also used writing as a way to process what I'm going through and how I feel about things. The way that my podcast kind of came into being is I had all these stories I wanted to share, and getting published as a children's author is really difficult. I was like, I have enough content. I have enough stuff. I have all these stories that I feel like have something to say, and we're just going to put them out there. And I use them with my daughter. We talk about George the duckling is afraid to swim, and George the duckling doesn't want to learn to swim, and how the mom in that story gives George, she says like, well, that's kind of silly. All your friends are swimming, all your brothers and sisters are swimming, and you don't need to have a fishing boat or, whatever to do everything you want to do. You could just go swim. And he's scared. He doesn't want to. At the end of the story, Mama Duckling says, because George wants boats. He wants boats instead of swimming. And at the end of the story, Mama Duck says, well, I can be your mama boat, and you get to use me as a boat until you're ready to learn to swim. The point is, even though it's a very silly story, that George can go...
Disagree. I don't think it's silly at all.
Well, Mama tells George the whole book. He's a very silly duckling. It is a silly story. It's a silly story. But he comes to Mama and he tells her what he wants. And then Mama has a way of being the mom, of being what you need me to be until you're ready to be it for yourself. I think that stories they're so beneficial in finding for parenting, right? Oh, that's a good parenting idea. I want to be a mama boat. I want to make sure that I'm giving my kid a framework to work through their fears, but also giving the kid language to say, I'm afraid and I don't want to do this. I'm scared, like George the duckling or whatever it is. I use these, if my daughter is going through something, any books, not just my stories, but a lot of times I think, oh, I'm really sad and upset because this friend is different from us. And well, do you remember what happened with Waffle and Falafel? They're very different. He likes soccer and he likes reading, but they're still friends, right? And everybody's happy. Everybody works together. And even if somebody makes fun of them because they're both so different, they work it out and they all end up being friends at the end, even though they're different. And I have a couple that are about where we come from and how that shapes us. I get very telly in those ones, very into the fae, very Irish. But there's one that there's a changeling baby and the mom is taking care of the changeling baby and everybody's like, oh, she's difficult because she's a changeling. She's difficult because she's not yours. She's difficult because this is the way she is. And it's the mom that goes and rescues her from going back into the fairy world. And she says, you can do this if you want. It is who you are. But I am your mother and I love you. And this is what we want. And this is what we would do for you. And it sounds so emotional when you read them in the story. It's a story.
But it's a metaphor. Exactly.
Yeah. So I want her to be able to think of these stories and know if I want to, I don't know what it would be, but if I want to go do this thing that like, maybe we thought you should be, I don't know, a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, and you're going to go sing songs for Disney or whatever it is, right? Like I want you to know maybe it's not what I thought that I wanted for you, but I'm still your mom and you can still come to me, right? Those are the...
Okay, so I'm sold, but I'm curious if you can share a little bit about where people can find both your podcast and maybe more information about you and where they can get your content.
Yeah, my podcast is Open Window Stories. It's everywhere that you can find podcasts. I release a story every 2 weeks, except for this week. I don't know when you're actually going to air this episode. This week is really exciting because I have a story called Happy Pizza that's going to be airing on Children's Stories for Bedtime, which is a much bigger children's stories podcast than mine. So I'm really excited about that. It also ties very nicely into the topics that we've talked about today. So I'm really excited about that one. I'm on Instagram at Open Window Stories. I'm also mgoody87 in my personal life. You'll see very boring family photos of me. Open Window Stories. Instagram has illustrations accompanying the stories, exciting news, that sort of thing. I'll post that this is airing on there. And that's really it.
It's amazing. Well, as we widen down over here, I like asking a few rapid fire questions. I'm curious. I know you've already shared one or two with crayons and cheese, but if there's a story that comes to mind that I guess you could say is a funny / hysterical / embarrassing story that you have either as a parent to your child or as a child towards your parents, that would take a short little snippet of your life, what would that be?
Okay, so this is the only story I could think of when you asked me this at the beginning, and it's horribly embarrassing for me, not for my daughter. But when we were in California, we lived maybe a half a mile away from this park, and that's where my daughter always wanted to go play. She had all her friends there. The only problem is there's no bathrooms at this park. So I am walking my daughter to the park. We get within eyesight distance of the park, and then I very urgently have to go to the bathroom. So I turn the jogger strolling around. I am literally running back home. The whole way my daughter is screaming, I didn't go to the park. I didn't go to the park. Scream, bawling. Just people are watching me. I barely make it into the bathroom, right? Doors wide open. Daughter's, I'm like, I've unstrapped her. She's in the house. She wanders up. She looks at me through the bathroom door. She gets this look on her face. She goes, Mama, run home, go poop. Yeah, that's what happened. And then, of course, the nanny came the next day and she goes, Mama, we're in home, go poop.
Yeah.
I have to tell the whole story.
Well, I guess that's another story that you will be telling over to your daughter, to her spouse one day.
Yeah.
If there would be one book that you would recommend that can help parents go through the grieving or the infertility process, not that it makes it any better, but something that could give a little bit of guidance, something that you would recommend that's not your own, what would that be?
Okay, so the one that we always tell families to read, even though it's very detailed and it's not necessarily a children's book, it was written by a nurse and I don't remember her name, but it's called Gone From My Sight. And it's a very, like anybody who knows they're going to lose somebody, if you have a terminally diagnosed, that's a very good resource, both for caring for people, just seeing what's happening, knowing what's going on in the body. It's usually my number one resource that I give to people. As far as infertility and books go, I don't have any good resources for that. I don't have a good book that tells of like how to deal with that. Because like I said, I tend to process things through storytelling. And like we talked about in the last episode, this wasn't a time in my life that I found myself in literature. This is a time where it's dictatorial and teaching. It's not a story about those things necessarily that I have been able to find. As far as processing grief with children, in a story way. There are so many, so many good books that you can search by age, that you can search by. I would say it's almost easier to look through your kid's bookshelf and see what's already there and relate that one. If there's a way, if this is something that's, like, God forbid, the Velveteen Rabbit, that's the one that I was the most used to as a child. Like, that one's, yes, it's horrible. The bunny dies. There's a big fire. But it is a way to process. It's a way to talk about being sick and the loss of something that's a toy, but it's a thoughtful toy. Walking through that, I think it's easier. And yes, like we said, Google, it's great. You can Google by age group story, to help. There's ones about grandparents. There's ones about everything. But if you're a reading family, if you already have a bunch of books,
go through those. Go
through the bookshelf and find the one that talks about something that is about loss. Or nobody gives librarians enough credit. They are very, very good at this.
Yes.
You go into a library and ask them for a topic, they will find it for you. And they are very good at it.
Yes. Thank you for saying that. And I think basically what I'm taking out of that is there is no right answer for how to deal with it with kids. It's about dealing with it in a way that's right for your child and finding that character, that story, that narrator that it's able to go ahead and give it over and help the process. And I think most importantly, it's to be there with your child and let them know that they're not doing this alone. I think that's a very, very big part. So thank you for that. My last question to you as we finish up here, if you can think of an everyday mundane superpower that you would like to have as mom, what would that be?
I want Molly Weasley's wand that cleans her house. I'm going to save so much time. I could do so much more with my time. The fact that she could just be like, she had a book of housekeeping spells. It's done. That was it.
Well, I think that's one that I would pay a lot of money for too. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much. Well, Meredith, this has been an absolute pleasure. I hope we get a chance to talk again soon. I think there are so many things that I've learned over the past 2 episodes, and I think something that could be taken from so many different areas of topics for all of our readers. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Hey again. I hope you were able to learn as much as I did today. Thank you so much for staying to the end and listening to the entire interview. Please feel free to leave a comment wherever you listen to this podcast. All comments will be read weekly, and we appreciate all feedback and ideas. If you have an idea for a guest or a specific topic, please feel free to share. Additionally, you can contact us at parentingiseasypodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's parentingiseasypodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for joining today, and remember, parenting is a journey. Don't forget to enjoy it. The goal is to be a little better today than yesterday, and hopefully better tomorrow than we were today.